So there's definitely going to be some kind of verdict served to TikTok, whether it's in a form of ban, a forced divestiture, or a forced sale, or simply making just things much harder for TikTok to operate in the US. Still, I think to investors, they expect Alibaba to be a growth company, but I think Alibaba is at a mature stage which will be analyzed very differently and judged differently by investors and by its own employees to try to understand its kind of way forward. We've been talking about TikTok and we think about all the recent kind of winners or companies that are winning in the US market, right? Shein, Temu, and all these companies. But we cannot overlook how long a lot of these OG Chinese companies have already been in the US. Baidu opened its first R&D center in the US in 2011. Alibaba's B2B commerce business first launched in 2019. And same with DJI, Tencent, and the rest of the crew. They've all been in the US for much longer than I think we remember. For Chinese companies just in the US, for them to first understand that the US media way is very, very different from how China does PR. In terms of the relationship building, the nurturing process, it's very different from China's media relation strategy.
Welcome to the Ginger River Radio podcast, a part of the GRR Media Outlet, and your go-to podcast for anything about the Chinese current events. I'm your host, Jiang, the founder of Ginger River Review, a newsletter that focuses on reporting the priorities of both the leadership and the general public in China, and views you do not normally see from mainstream English language media. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, go to www.gingerriver.com and sign up to join our community of avid China watchers. Now, let's dive into our podcast show today. In this episode, we'll be focusing on two companies that have been at the forefront of recent discussions among China watchers, TikTok and Alibaba. Just a few weeks ago, millions of people worldwide watched TikTok CEO Shou Chu face tough questions from US Congress members during a hearing at the US Capitol. The session was convened to explore concerns over whether the Chinese government and employees of TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, could potentially exploit the app for surveillance or to promote content favorable to Chinese interests.
How can you promise that that will move into the United States of America and be protected here?
Congresswoman, I have seen no evidence that the Chinese government has access to that data. They have never asked us. We have not provided.
Well, you know what? I find that actually preposterous.
I have looked in. I have seen no evidence of this happening. And in order to assure everybody here and all our users, our commitment is to move the data into the United States to be stored on American soil by an American company, overseen by American personnel. So the risk will be similar to any government going to an American company asking for data.
On March 28th, China's technology giant Alibaba made headlines with its founder Jack Ma's return to China and an announcement of a major restructuring, splitting its business into 6 primary units, a landmark move in the company's 24-year history. These 6 divisions will focus on cloud intelligence, Taobao Tmall commerce, local services, Cainiao smart logistics, global digital commerce, and digital media and entertainment. Join me to talk about the recent news on these 2 companies today is Ivy Yang. She has worked in strategic communications and in corporate comms for more than a decade, including 2 years at Alibaba Group. She now writes an opt column called Discourse Power or 话语权时代 for FT China and has written for the China Project. She follows topics from TikTok to cross-border e-commerce to the effects of the CHIPS Act and much more. Ivy was born in Wuhan and grew up in Los Angeles. She graduated from New York University and Columbia Business School and now lives and works in New York. Hi, Ivy. Welcome to Ginger River Radio.
Hi, Jiang. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. I think your extensive experience in both China and the US and your deep knowledge of the industry just makes you an ideal guest for our episode today. And I'm excited to hear your thoughts on these topics. Let's talk about TikTok first. There is no lack of stories in both the US and China about the TikTok hearing, including a Wall Street Journal article titled "Why Chinese Apps Are the Favorites of Young Americans," in which you provided valuable insights. Based on your observations, Ivy, how has the TikTok news been received by the public in both China and the US, particularly among the young American TikTok users?
Yeah, there really has been a flurry of stories in both countries, like you said. But what I found really surprising, it's really the intense interest in China for an app that most users can't even use in China, because TikTok is, you can't use it in China. From the line-to-line translations of exchanges between the CEO and the lawmakers to really like all the deep dive on all the potential repercussions for TikTok in terms of a ban or a divestiture. It's really interesting to me that like China has really taken such an interest in this. And I think the underlying reasons for why TikTok is faced with all these challenges in the US is another thing that Chinese audience is also kind of, building their own kind of theories upon. And what I thought was really kind of important to note is also like on the Chinese side, the level of sophistication about the issue. It's surprising and not surprising at the same time, given kind of the intense interest that China has about kind of all things that's happening in the US. But the takeaway, I think, for the Chinese audience from the hearing is really the absurdities and the grandstanding that is really an inevitable part of like the democratic process, which involves these hearings. But also kind of like there's a lot of kind of chit chat on the Chinese internet about the level of just pure ignorance, right? About the state of technology that these lawmakers have shown to really the world, that they really understood very little. And it's really about kind of attacking TikTok from their perspectives. So for them to properly regulate it and for them to even understand the issues at hand, I think for the Chinese audience, that was, eye-opening. In the US, I would say that there is a divergence between kind of what the public sphere, what I would call like the mainstream media that's reporting about what the hearing really meant. There's kind of the use of the word like grilling, right, of the TikTok CEO. And a lot of media reporting also focused on the questions that Shou couldn't give satisfactory answers to. And really, even after the hearing, right, a lot of concerns still remain. Basically, the real issue is that TikTok is owned by the company that is based in Beijing. And it's really, really hard to argue that TikTok is completely independent. And even when Shou really tried to explain that during the hearing that, they are completely separate, that they are an American company, it's very hard for him to guarantee that the Chinese government won't, like what they decide to do with ByteDance, really it's something that he cannot guarantee, given that he is the CEO of TikTok. And but I think like overall, the goal of the hearing was not to answer all of the questions or even make promises. It's about stalling. It's about not appear confrontational and to be collaborative. And in that sense, I think the goal was achieved. And I think the reach goal was if the internet falls in love with Shou, which is totally is the case, I think, on both sides of the aisle. I think that is kind of like for TikTok, that's kind of the cherry on top. So that's kind of, at least from my perspective, kind of what the US and the China kind of media landscape, kind of how their kind of reaction to the hearing.
Yeah, I also observed that actually interesting is that many Chinese people watch the congression, at least the highlights of the congressional hearing from the Chinese versions of TikTok, the Douyin apps. And I noticed that you also have written for the China Project about TikTok and its many challenges in the US after the congressional hearing, and specifically on how much work TikTok has put in order to be perceived as being American enough. Now TikTok faces an uncertain future as it tries to calibrate between Chinese and American interests. You suggested at the end of the article that it is hard for TikTok to maintain allegiance to both of Chinese and American interests simultaneously. So in your opinion, what are the key factors for TikTok in addressing the current dilemma? We know that at the beginning of the hearing, actually, Shou Chu addressed 4 commitments to address the concerns of the American Congress members and the public. So what do you think about the key factors for TikTok now in addressing this current dilemma?
I think TikTok is really just stuck in between a rock and a hard place. And the issues are really beyond TikTok. It's really about the US-China and how it's really in the midst of all the geopolitical tensions that kind of TikTok is become this poster child for that tension. And I think the rhetoric and discussions about the national security, privacy, data security, they're issues way bigger than TikTok. But at the same time, right, TikTok also, the way that it handles the discussion carries a lot of weight and represent not just TikTok, the subsidiary of ByteDance, but also the intent and the attitude of its parent company. I think that will always be analyzed together. And no matter how hard TikTok tries to separate itself from ByteDance, I think, at least in the West, that is something that it's just not going to be the case. And also, like, TikTok is part of that trend with all these other Chinese companies who are looking to expand into overseas market in the US and in Europe. And, you know, it is that poster child of Chinese tech in increasingly globalizing, but at the same time kind of deglobalizing world. So I don't think there's really the right answer for how TikTok can address the current dilemma. It's just kind of have to go with the flow with how it's currently handling, right? It is doing a lot of lobbying right now in DC, and it is trying to kind of showcase a more proactive stance, right? To show that the lawmakers that we are doing a lot, whether it's the Texas plan or it's all of the other things that it's trying to do. They're really trying to prove that they are making an effort. But at the same time, I think their China kind of DNA, it's very, very hard to separate itself from.
Yeah, you mentioned about the Texas project, which is also another, I believe, an effort that Shou Chu trying to make sure that the American people can accept that, because he said that the data is saved in America and is being monitored by Americans. And but it's still hard. I saw lots of people, express their ideas about how TikTok should act in the next step. And I came across a thought-provoking tweet by Nathan Mabubi, a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. He proposed a 4-step strategy for TikTok. Number 1 is stop fighting US ban, let it happen. The second one is strictly adhere to world-leading data security practices. And the third is regularly point out how the US social media companies fell well short of the same situation. And the last one is to build up TikTok's presence in the rest of the world to make Americans feel FOMO. I'm not sure that is like the plan that TikTok will accept, but it seems a very realistic suggestion. So what are your thoughts on the eventual outcome of TikTok's situation? Some say it is unlikely that TikTok is going to be banned because Meta, Google, and other big tech companies also have similar issues. And the congressional hearing, as you just mentioned, sometimes it's just more about put pressure on TikTok to make a concession in the negotiation in the future.
I think that is the million-dollar question, and I think how you framed it is exactly the case. It's nobody knows what the ban will look like. I think there are a lot of people have opined about kind of the legality of a ban, right? And the lawyers definitely are more they have more, like, they're more invested in the issue than I can attempt to explain. But at the same time, I think it's all looking like it's kind of setting the stage, right, for some kind of negotiation that has to happen. There's the pressure from the Biden administration, whether it's the Restrict Act or the Data Act, to try to kind of almost showcase what it could look like when they are going to kind of apply pressure to not just like TikTok, but for all Chinese tech companies. But at the same time, like they're also trying to figure out like how to do it so that they don't run into the same issues that the Trump administration did, which was kind of a very sudden like attack. And now they're kind of setting the stage, and I think it is to gain more of a negotiation advantage into how to deal with the TikTok issue. But I don't think a ban is very realistic. But at the same time, I think right now anything could happen. But I think for the Biden administration also, TikTok is becoming this kind of political imperative. It's kind of what the Chinese call 势在必得, right? They really want to figure out a way for them to manage this, to show that, at least show a segment of the voter that they're doing something about it. So there's definitely going to be some kind of verdict served to TikTok, whether it's in a form of ban, a forced divestiture, or a forced sale, or simply making just things much harder for TikTok to operate in the US. I think those are kind of the different kind of degrees of options that I think can all happen to TikTok in the near future.
Yeah, so do you think other than a complete ban, maybe a compulsory sale, a forced sale, or maybe a transfer of technology is more possible than being banned in the US for TikTok?
I think the latter two options are more possible than a ban, because when there's a ban, I don't think there's like nobody benefits from it. And I think one of the arguments that TikTok has been making through its kind of, its kind of media relations and a lot of its kind of lobbying talk points is that TikTok is generating a lot of job opportunities. It is a content creation platform that is creating a lot of different options for creators. So I think from that point of view, I think it's going to be really, really hard to just completely ban the app. And also just like interestingly, when we were talking about kind of the differences between how the traditional media and China is like looking at the hearing and the issue of TikTok, I think there's also kind of like the third media outlet, which is like actually on TikTok. I actually spent a lot of time after the hearing on TikTok, and there is no shortage of like just the millennial and the Gen Z creators, TikTokers, or just users just completely like not okay with the potential that the app is banned, and how like the kind of memes that kind of have blossomed since that. It's very difficult for me to believe that that's all kind of TikTok's teams or TikTok's kind of creators doing all of that. I think there's also that's also a reflection of a segment of like the much younger demographic, which is also a voter demographic that both sides are trying to win over. And I think if they do decide to ban TikTok, I don't think that's a great look for the Gen Zs who are of voting age.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you if you think that maybe a short-term effects of the congressional hearing might be like losing lots of users, but actually, I believe, according to what you have just said and observed, it is not likely, right? The next generation, I mean, the Sims are going to stick to using this app because it's just really convenient and
yeah,
popular
I think
them,
so.
right?
And I feel like there's got to be a reason why a lot of these people are on TikTok versus like Reels or YouTube or all the other mediums. I think there's something about it. I'm not an avid enough user on TikTok to fully understand the platform and like it's like the whole culture of it. But I've begun using it enough to kind of understand the anger. But it's super fascinating to me. I guess it's because like you and I are, but they keep on trying to convince us that they're like all their users are not just Gen Zs, but I feel like it's definitely not my choice of social media app that I constantly use and really addicted to compared to some of the other apps. But I don't know, maybe we are still like outside of their age range for the app. I don't know. Do you use TikTok a lot?
Yeah. I use, but not that often. I mean, the Chinese version of TikTok, Douyin, like a lot, because there's just lots of interesting things on that. I think the logic, I mean, we say this, the 底层逻辑 of these two apps are almost the same, right? It just keeps feeding you the things that you like to watch. Yeah, but I believe TikTok, in terms of the, as you just mentioned, the core users of it, maybe we are not. They are like the most targeted ones. Yeah.
I don't think we are, but I think Douyin also, I think like, at least anecdotally, I feel like a lot of, like my family members, like in China, they would use Douyin versus like, I don't feel like, people in their 40s plus 40 to kind of 60 age kind of segment would use TikTok. I don't like, that's something I've always wondered, but I'm sure they have a lot of stats proving me wrong on this.
Yeah. My mom, I think she preferred to use Kuaishou rather than Douyin. So maybe there has a generation focused in terms of the different apps. And I think another interesting that because now more and more enterprises are paying more attention on entering into the U.S. market. You also touched a little bit on that just now. And so do you think that this current situation with TikTok in the U.S. will have a negative impact on the technology industry as well as the openness of the market in the U.S. as a whole? Or it will only impact Chinese companies or all companies whose parent company is a Chinese company that either plans to enter the U.S. market or is already operating there?
I think that's a huge if. And I think the whole designation of like what is a Chinese company, what makes a Chinese company like a U.S. company, I think these are very fluid concepts now. Like there's the legal way of defining if you're like, for example, TikTok it's based in the U.S. but also in Singapore, right? But we still think of it as a Chinese company because it is a subsidiary of ByteDance. And you also, I keep on thinking about like TSMC, right? TSMC is really kind of building its presence in the U.S. in Arizona to start. But when you think about TSMC, like a lot of their talent is from, they are from Taiwan. A lot of their equipment is from, Europe, and their know-how is kind of, in the U.S. and in Taiwan and globally. They have talent that kind of contribute to that process from all over the world. But because but in the case of like TSMC, because it is based in Arizona, it makes it, I guess, an American entity. Versus TikTok, it is an American entity, but we still kind of relate it back to its Beijing-based entity. So I don't know. I think this question is a huge question, but I just think that from my perspective, and I think about this a lot from the perspective of like communicating and corporate affairs, and from how do you adapt to the local market that you're in. And I think that is something that is in constant motion. And I think we had to think it beyond just the physical location and think about more like its DNA and how it wants to be kind of perceived as American or as Chinese or none of it. I just think that the idea of a global company in this day and age has to evolve, and I think it hasn't fully gone through the process yet.
Yeah, sure. I hope they can figure out a way to get it work because many enterprises are watching, and it's a great app. Speaking of enterprises, let's now switch to Alibaba. The same question I would like to ask first is, how has the Alibaba's breakup plan been received by the public in both China and the US, according to your observation?
I actually think you might be more, you probably are watching this from kind of both that side a lot more than I am. Because I think from my perspective, there are kind of the investors, right, opinion. And I think it's great. Everybody's super happy because like the sum of its parts sometimes just means that it's a lot more complicated. And it's for the investors, it's a lot harder to analyze. So now that they're kind of in its own kind of businesses, like it's much more clear to see what are the like transfer prices of kind of like the internal management. What are some of the challenges and who is actually subsidizing whom? Because in the old system where it's kind of like the group and then the subsidiaries, it's very hard to fully see that and to analyze that. So I think at least for the investor in the US, at least, I think they're really happy and all the shareholders are really happy. But in China, I think I haven't seen a lot of negative pieces about it. Have you?
I don't think I see any like much negative comments on that, and I feel that it's more about like enterprise strategic like plans that maybe the public don't care that much. And Daniel Zhang he mentioned that he hoped the whole group or the new the units could be more agile, reactive to the current the market situations, so it will benefit them. At least Alibaba Group believe that it will benefit each of the groups, so they can react more quickly to the things happening in the market. But of course, in the short term, maybe they have to they need some time to adapt to that situation. So I think it's more about how the other enterprises, especially the competitors of Alibaba, see these changes. And according to the latest plan, Alibaba will ensure that these 6 independent business groups, they can be responsible for their own profit and loss. And each business group will form its own board of directors, implementing a CEO responsibility system under the leadership of the respective boards. And under this model, Alibaba will act as a holding company, managing each business group while allowing individual business groups the opportunity to go public independently. I guess that is also part of the reason that you mentioned about some investors are happy to see about this. Besides the e-commerce segment, because we know the domestic e-commerce business of Alibaba Group actually accounted for about 2/3 of the group's revenue. Besides that, who will be the winners and losers, and what could be the potential outcomes of some of the BUs, in your opinion?
I personally think that the domestic e-commerce business will continue to do really, really well, just because now that it doesn't have to subsidize all of the losing kind of like BUs, it probably has a much better chance of focusing its efforts just doing what it does best. So I think that will kind of refocus, like you were saying, like refocus the effort and become more agile. And it is also an intensely competitive segment, right? In China, there's like JD and Pinduoduo, and I think they are definitely in need of some kind of, not a full pivot, but definitely to kind of refocus their efforts so that they could really kind of run the business without having to fully fulfill kind of group level strategy. But I think the biggest loser probably are the BUs that do require a lot of investment, and it's a lot of kind of zero-sum competition in China. The one that comes to mind is kind of local services, right? That is the BU that has been bleeding a lot of money, and they are also the kind of business, because the switching costs, I mean, we both lived in China. We know that like for consumers at least, like to get delivery from one platform versus the other, the switching cost is so low that there's really very little kind of customer stickiness. So it requires the business kind of really continuously investing in acquiring customers and just ensuring that there is that scale for the business to make sense. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how local services will operate in the near future, especially in the next, I guess, quarter after this change, because without the kind of subsidies, how will it kind of fully survive and thrive the way that I'm sure the business will want to? But there's also a lot of competition, like Meituan, for example, and they compared to like Alibaba, Meituan, similarly, right? Like the e-commerce, and even like international e-commerce, like Meituan, it's like really focused on this local services model versus like to Alibaba, this is like a big part of it, but it's also not everything. So like that laser focus on the business itself, I think that is intent of this whole restructuring. But whether it will survive long enough for this, for it to take effect, I'm a little skeptical.
Mm-hmm. And what are the new opportunities and challenges for Alibaba Group after the restructuring? I have heard some of my friends who are former employees say that Alibaba actually, some say it has developed a big company syndrome, which is not unusual, but will the restructuring help that and may lead to a new era of Alibaba?
I think the whole purpose of this, it is to cure the big company syndrome, right? I think that is a huge, huge part of it. And theoretically, like this whole attempt, like we were just literally speaking about kind of refocusing and giving the power back to the businesses, and it can lead to better planning. And they could do better capital allocation because they don't have to support money losing ones. They could redirect and really build according to their own needs. But I think like it's going to be difficult even on an individual BU level if the whole 大公司病, which I think a lot of people have written about, it's not even the growing pains anymore. It's Alibaba, it's at a scale large enough that it still, I think to investors, they expect Alibaba to be a growth company, but I think Alibaba is at a mature stage which will be analyzed very differently and judged differently by investors and by its own employees to try to understand its kind of way forward. So I think 大公司病 is a huge part of it. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, I think the big company syndrome is like a common issue that lots of big companies have to face and want to figure out a way to solve. And you mentioned about Meituan. Do you expect any other internet companies like Tencent to spill up like Alibaba? Will Alibaba's competitors, including JD.com and Jingdong and Pinduoduo, to take advantage of the opportunity to expand market share through the restructuring? Or maybe it's not an opportunity for them because maybe they are going to face an even stronger Alibaba because each of the 6 divisions may have the flexibility and freedom to develop their own growth strategies. As you said, that they are going to be more focused and maybe they can have more customized strategy against their competitors.
I think they all have different challenges, but it's a really interesting question because I think for Alibaba, the split, it's really significant because I think for the past, I would say 5 years, like Alibaba has been really focused on integration and facilitating coordination and like really kind of centralizing kind of the power, right? And really kind of all aggregating that into the group versus I don't think any of Alibaba's competitor has been this intentional about doing that. For example, Alibaba has been talking about the 中台战略, the mid-platform strategy, for a really long time. And that was kind of Daniel Zhang's like big kind of plan and strategy. And it's really all about kind of how to mobilize internal capabilities and rally the troops and how to incentivize all the BUs to help one another. At least kind of on the surface, I think that was the intention of the 中台战略. But it's really like it's the idea that everything is in support of the group it's very, very idealistic. And I think it disregards corporate behavior and assumes that like employees will just march to the same beat of the drum and really just being okay having their fate decided for them with very little discretion and consideration for their career trajectory. Because I think Zhongtai, it's all about being very, very coordinated and having all of the small pieces in service of kind of the bigger, grander goal. I think this is also kind of significant in that it points to, in my own opinion, 大公司病, right? Like big company syndrome, that you think that you could use this kind of strategy to manage behavior. So I don't know whether or not like all the other companies will follow through, but I do believe that this is a watershed moment, and have no doubt that all of the technology companies are watching it to see exactly what Alibaba's plan and how it is executed. I think that will determine whether or not they do something similar or know that this is not the way to go.
Mm-hmm. And how will Alibaba's restructuring affect its overseas strategy and development? And will what TikTok experience in the US affect Alibaba's overseas strategic layout?
I think one thing that like we've been talking about TikTok and we think about all the recent kind of winners or companies that are winning in the US market, right? Shein, Temu, and all these companies. But we cannot overlook how long a lot of these OG Chinese companies have already been in the US. So some stats, right? Baidu opened its first R&D center in the US in 2011. Alibaba's B2B commerce business first launched in 2019. And same with DJI, Tencent, and the rest of the crew. They've all been in the US for much longer than I think we remember. AliExpress, for example, has been in the US for more than a decade. And I think with the whole kind of revamp that the consolidating of the international commerce business under Jiang Fan, when he took the helm in 2022, I think the overseas business has become more strategically important. And that hasn't really been the case because Alibaba's core commerce was just so successful that for the overseas business, it's kind of it's great to have, but it's also in some ways an afterthought. And also Alibaba, I think it's also been one of the first and the earliest, right, trumpeting globalization. And when it IPO'd in the US, and it's been really loud and kind of strong in kind of talking about globalization and really want to do more in that space. And I've kind of written about that idea too in one of my FT pieces. The whole idea that Alibaba, it's a mature company now, as we were just talking about a moment ago. And given all the signals and organizational strategies and even some of the challenges it's been facing, it is at a mature stage. And right now for Alibaba, how it transitions from a growth company to a mature company, at least in the eyes of investors, I think that requires a lot of recalibration, and that will also take a lot of convincing, because I think this is exactly what they're trying to do, to kind of refocus on the priorities and costs and cut redundancies and starting to make choices that will ensure that its growth will continue to be sustainable. So I think this overseas market share, and I think in the recent earnings calls, they've tried to really emphasize that it is increasingly important. It's a huge part of the puzzle, but it's also definitely a work in progress. In the recent earnings report, core e-commerce, Alibaba's cash cow, like you said earlier, with 2/3 of the business. The international commerce is merely 8% of revenue. It's clear what the priority is given revenue contribution. As core commerce growth slows down, and it really has been, international commerce has become much more important. But it will be really interesting to see after this whole restructuring how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned actually lots of Chinese companies, they have existed in the US years ago than which might be ignored by some people. And what suggestions do you have for the Chinese companies to expand overseas, especially in the Western markets in the future?
I think one of the biggest challenges is, like, I guess for larger Chinese tech companies or even smaller consumer brands, hardware or other Chinese businesses, is that they have to accept that there is a huge learning curve to adapt to the norms and rules of the country. And I think having respect, 敬畏之心, I think in early stages is really, really important. I think in the US, I've observed that companies really take a page, right, when they're launching in the US. Like how they're operating in China, they try to replicate some of that here. And sometimes that is the secret sauce that kind of gives them an advantage over their US competitors. But a lot of times this involves, like, fly the special forces team from China to run the US business. They hire some local talent, but try to really make them learn the ways of their Chinese kind of counterparts and expect full allegiance and how they follow the strategies and execute their strategies. Just trying to replicate how things are done in China and culturally to the US. And, a result is that there's literally always a lot of tension between kind of the corporate level and then also the overseas kind of departments or businesses. But at the same time, though, like, I think this time around, compared to kind of previous rounds of Chinese companies going overseas, they're also under a lot more pressure to succeed and to really prove that there is a business case to operate and to be in the US. Versus, I think before, a lot of the Chinese tech companies, they open up R&D centers in the States and really kind of, they want to hire US-based talent. And when they're launching businesses in the US, they want, it's more like a trial and error. Let's see if this sticks. Let's see if it works out. But I think for this crop of kind of newcomers, like new companies in the US, they're really keen on diversifying their markets and succeeding in the US and in other Western countries. And I think, like, for, at least from my vantage point, I think there's the basic things of trying to understand the product market fit, spending time about learning the target audience and pivot strategy when, on the ground learnings and experiences demand so. And I keep on thinking back to the idea of, like, 不要死磕 这件事情. I think for a lot of Chinese companies, that's also really important, and pivot when they need to. But I think it's much easier said than done. But definitely the temptation to 死磕 or tenaciously, like, uphold the original plan, I think resisting it's, half the battle. And I think from the communications side, it's all about relearning the communication norms and the ways to do it properly, both internally and to an external audience. And they're actually very much connected. I think for Chinese companies, just in the US, for them to first understand that the US media way is very, very different from how China does PR. In terms of the relationship building, the nurturing process, it's very different from China's media relation strategy. And I think in the US, definitely reporters have a lot more autonomy. And there's, of course, always a chance for negative press. That's not a part of the plan. But I think, like, disclosure and compliance are much more closely monitored. And I think the US, I think this is a big one, is that sometimes you cannot PR your way out of things in the US. And that's something I cannot stress enough. But it's also very, very difficult sometimes to set the context on kind of, helping Chinese companies understand that that is the norm and the way that things are done in the US. And the internal communication side is also really important because employer branding really is very, very important and affects a company's access to the best and the brightest talent pool. And that's often overlooked and I think also really, really important for Chinese companies that are looking to expand overseas to kind of start caring about that. Like, how you are perceived kind of in the hiring process and in the talent pool will affect really kind of your team and how you do in the US. So those are a couple points that come to mind.
Yeah, fantastic. I think years ago that Chinese companies talking about Chuhai, you expand their market overseas, and I believe through the years of, they have much more experience, and they can become more adaptive to the scenarios in other countries. And there's still lots of things to learn. Now let's move on to recommendations. We invite every guest of our podcast to recommend something to our listeners. It can be a book, a movie, a TV series, a podcast, or video game, or any other things. Ivy, what do you have for us today?
One of my favorite things to read, and I feel like it's the best kept secret because it started before the Substack era. And it's called the Marginalian. It was originally named Brain Pickings. It's really kind of like a book review plus analysis and just musings and thoughts and insights written by this one person. And she's been doing it for more than a decade. And I started following a long, long time ago. It's almost like the kind of things you read to escape for you to also find book recommendations. So the way that the blog or the posts are, it's the way the writer condenses books into insights and then kind of bring other books and insights and then just kind of threads it in the most perfect way. And the goal of it really is to just kind of inspire you on all these new ideas that you kind of just had no idea even existed. It's like this quest to search for meaning and to find joy in the mundane and the profound, and the way that Maria kind of threads all these ideas together. It's really, really hard to explain. You have to read it to fully understand. And I shared with you, Zhang. Did you take a look? What did you think of it?
I think actually it's I would say it's 脑洞很大. It has lots of different thinking patterns in terms of how you view books or some certain type of writings, and I think that's a great recommendation. And I like the name Brain Pickings. It's just very to the point.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. It's really like picking her incredible brain and learn something new, and it's amazing.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I'd also like to recommend an insightful op-ed by Ivy on Temu, the Chinese e-commerce juggernaut, Pinduoduo's overseas e-commerce platform. You can find this piece on my friend and former colleague Zicheng Wang's Substack newsletter, Packinology, which is now part of the portfolio of Center for China and Globalization, CCG, a think tank. In the article, Ivy analyzed Temu's Super Bowl strategy, which include a jingle that sings the lyrics, "Shop like a billionaire," and Temu's logic in spending big bucks on conversion and the unintended consequences of Temu's marketing strategies in the US. And thank you once more, Ivy. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm looking forward to having you back on the show in the future because there's just so much more to talk about: tech, e-commerce, chips, and many other things around China and US.
Yeah, this was really, really fun. Thanks so much for having me, Zhang.
Thank you, Ivy. The Ginger River Radio Podcast is a part of the GR Media outlet. Our show is produced and edited by me, Jiang, Yu Liaojie from Shanghai International Studies University, and Jia Yuxuan from Beijing Foreign Studies University. For cooperation, investing, or feedback, email me directly at jiangjang, JIANG, at gingerriver.com, or just give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. We would be delighted if you would recommend our podcast or newsletter to others if you find it helpful. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Take care.